Okay. Well, welcome to Yeniska Mountain Adventures and our guides talk, our guides chat. I'm Pat Delaney, and today we'll be talking a little bit about 20 years of ice guiding in the Canadian Rockies. Doing it at a tempo that has been so far quite significant, as much as 100 days of winter. And just wanted to chat a little bit. And then first, hopefully everyone's doing well. Kind of a crazy time. It's definitely been crazy for me. It's made a crazy guy even crazier. And it's really cool to be back in the YAM office right now, being able to do this. It's been a very trying time, but I think I'm moving on with life and see what gives. So let's chat a little bit about, well, I guess a little bit about me, about ice climbing. I've been sort of like chipping ice. I think the first few times I chipped ice was about 16 years old. I was born in Ottawa, Ontario. And that's kind of where it all started, and eventually made my way a little bit around the world and settled into Squamish, British Columbia, and eventually Canmore, Alberta. Without further ado, I'll just kind of move on to my slideshow here. Bear with me if things get crazy. I'll have to call Tim into the room. We're social distancing right now. Are we good, Tim? Awesome. Okay. So yeah, started in Ottawa. This is the first place I started ice climbing. This is called Rideau Falls, not too far from the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister's home or residence, I should say. And if you guys can see my cursor, Tim, can they see my cursor? Full screen. Sorry, we're going to go to full screen. Awesome. That's even better. On the right-hand side here is the typical sort of mixed walls that were surrounding the ice itself. Rideau Falls was a kind of a serious place to go ice climbing. As you can kind of see, there's quite a bit of water. But when you live in Ottawa, you're kind of desperate. So it's kind of a mini Helcom Falls in some zones here, a big cauldron and so on and so forth. See a bit of the nature of the ice. The ice would come in and out very quickly. It was a great time to learn. I mean, we climbed with leashes back then. We were discovering things. Ice screws were hard to place. The climbs were roughly about like 15 to 20 meters or so. And this little icicle in the background was the site of my first ice climbing fall. I've taken 2 in my career. And this one here, I linked up a bunch of ice and came off with a whole pillar. I tried to track down a picture that's really cool. It's hard to tell what's going on. It just looks like I'm ice climbing until you notice my quick draws that are facing upwards because I'm falling off with the pillar. And I was being belayed by this man, Steve Berman. Steve was my very first ice climbing partner. Steve unfortunately passed away at the age of 34 of a congenital heart defect, and I have still to this day haven't really processed his loss. We adventured tons together. I used to work at the MEC in Ottawa, and when I was in university, and we'd get calls from Steve Montgomery, and was good friends with Al Black, who lives in Canmore now. And Steve would tell us of these ice climbs and unclimbed stuff. And Steve and I probably put together probably close to maybe 20 first ascents in Western Quebec, Eastern Ontario, the Upper Ottawa Valley. And I came across a guidebook 5 or 6 years ago, and a lot of our first ascents had been first ascended by someone else. We never really reported them. There really wasn't that kind of a community back then. Anyway, it's really cool to know that people are still climbing this stuff. Anyways, after the move to Squamish and getting into the Rockies here, I'll just kind of maybe a brief mention on the coast where I started guiding as an apprentice rock guide. At the time, the regulations were a little bit loose. There was a lack of ice guides, and the industry was asking for ice guides. So we had a bit of an ice assessment, and we were given free rein. And I guided primarily for Whistler Alpine Guides Bureau and Slipstream Rock and Ice. Both of them no longer exist as companies. But the Whistler Guides Bureau kept me going. It was probably the first sort of like go ahead, and being on the coast, it wasn't very clear sometimes what we were climbing. I did a few first ascents, things like Kyoto Chimney with these two gentlemen from Kyoto. Cool story about that. The climb kind of topped out at one point, and I had to climb these roots that sort of like fell off of this big tree over this, bare rock. And I was kind of excited dry tooling these roots. And before I got to the anchor, I kind of whooped like, woo! And, I was like, no big deal, top out, get to the tree and start belaying or sorting out the belay, I should say. And I looked down, and my belayers are all over. The two belayers are like, they're gathering snow. One's melting snow and one's kind of gathering snow. And they've taken me off belay at a point in time, which I'm not too clear about. And perhaps because of my yell, they thought I was off belay. Anyways, I kind of adjusted pretty quickly to those kinds of mistakes, but I've had those moments throughout my career since then. Anyways, back to the Canadian Rockies. The big draw for me was mixed climbing, and early on, I would guide intermittently. I didn't have a whole bunch of work. I had more time. Did a lot of mixed climbing. This is a route called Canadian Bacon. It's just by a route called Slaughterhouse behind Ice 9. Really cool line. Routes like the Golden Bull. This is in the Bull River Canyon with Gordon MacArthur. All this stuff is what kind of like, would help me be really ready for a full schedule of guiding. Mixed climbing was a way of getting pretty strong, and given the demands of ice climbing, they're not as high, but I was guiding 5 and 6 days a week, and so mixed climbing kind of helped with that. Lots of cool ice. This is a token pole. This was a photo shoot with Paul Bride, Sarah Hunican. Just chucking some steep laps there. I must have guided token pole some 20 times over my career, maybe a bit more. This was the Fang and Fist. This was like a little soloing venture. This was a photo taken by Ryan Creary. It's a bit grainy, but I don't recall what the whole project was, but it seemed like a good idea that day. Soloing was something I used to do a lot of, and I can't recall the last time I went out soloing for soloing's sake, per se. White Man Falls, another route I've guided a whole bunch. This is kind of like my sort of favorite grade 6 or my intro grade 6. You can taper it down quite a. I mean, I probably climbed White Man Falls at a grade I suggest is probably at 4+, to be really honest, and probably climbed it as hard as 6+ and change. Further right tends to be a little bit harder, and around the left-hand side tends to be more sustained but straightforward. This is a cool shot of on the Replicant, John Furneaux in the background, another Canadian guide, another Paul Bride picture. I never guided the Replicant, but I did guide Sea of Vapors, and with an Italian gentleman who was incredibly strong, probably would have climbed laps around me as a rock climber. But that was probably the hardest ice I've ever guided was on Sea of Vapors. I suggest a stiff 6+. Stiff 6+. And getting into guiding the story, so I did do a lot of challenging guiding over the years. This was a perspective from a guest on curtain call in one of its harder conditions, kind of busting through the upper cruxes here. You can see some of the gear. So I protect myself fairly well. That seems to be a standard with me throughout the years. I've maintained good quality protection whenever I can. Guinness Gully, probably my most climbed ice route in the Canadian Rockies. I don't have a number, but I would suggest I've climbed it at least 4 times in 1 week. And I probably have done, it'd be fair to assume 100 ascents of Guinness Gully. Yeah, it'd be probably fair to assume that. And this is my favorite area to guide. This is a route called Twisted. I call it an area because there's a variety of different options there. Even if you get kind of scooped by another party, you know, you can find some good climbing. You can taper it down. You can kind of link up sections and reduce the grade for your guests if that's required. Or you can kind of like punch it up something and make it quite challenging. So further right, there's a route called Untwisted, which I think goes at 6+. I think it's a Johnny Red route or John Walsh route, but I'm not super clear about that. In this today, I think there was the main thing I really wanted to chat about was some of my guests, and there's 2 guests when it comes to ice climbing that I couldn't sit down today and talk about. One of them is Gerald Blanchard. If I'm clear, Jerry and I have climbed together for like 13 years. This was Jerry's last day with me on ice. Who knows in the age of COVID? I hope Jerry and I get to play together in the mountains again. We have some cool stories, and there's a great one about Jerry. And those who have heard about the boot story will get to talk about that. So this was our last day, Jerry and I, and this was the first day, or the first day on ice. I guided Jerry on a rock day on Mother's Day buttress in the summertime after he climbed the Grand Teton, and this was on Lake Louise Falls. So back then, Jerry was kind of like mastering the art. He came fit every single year. This was him sort of like with the leashes back in the day when we're kind of starting to get rid of leashes slowly by slowly. This was on Weeping Wall left, and a challenging route, a route that I've never really liked, actually. I find like Weeping Wall right more straightforward. Weeping Wall left has a variety of thin sections, hollow sounding features. It's a lot of work, it seems like, to guide that route. So I've probably only done like Weeping Wall left like maybe 5 or 6 times versus the maybe 30 times or so, or maybe a bit more that I've climbed Weeping Wall right. There was definitely a period of time when I was apprenticing under Steve Holetzi, who is now a member of public safety. Steve just didn't mind getting up really early and driving a whole bunch. So we would climb Weeping Wall like multiple times a week. Top out to Sniveling Gully. Many years later, again with Jerry. Cool zone, like, you know, Weeping Wall offers a lesser level of avalanche hazard, not to say no avalanche hazard, and it gets a lot of good sun. So that works against you and for you when it's really cold. And here's Jerry in the cave on that first day. A good friend. And this is the boot story. So this happened last winter during a cold spell. This is yours truly with goggles. If I bring goggles, it's probably a really cold day. And in the background, I think that might be Jerry, but I get the suspicion because we only had one phone between us. Contrary to some belief, we had one phone, but we had GoPros and other cameras. And so this is probably the GoPro. That's probably Alex Lawson coming in here. So here's the story. Jerry and I have been on Cascade before, maybe even a couple of years prior, and Jerry dropped a tool. And given the day and given the circumstances and other parties, we decided to call it. And that day we had a turnaround time of about 2:30 on the day last year. And I'm at the base of the last pitch and I look at the time and it's a bit past 2:30, but I go like, let's push it. And we got one pitch to do. Well, I'm cold down here. It's chilly. And so I top out, and anyone who's topped out on Cascade before, the anchor I chose is a little bit out of sight from the top out of the actual ice. So the tube we see from the highway, there's a little section after that, a bit of a ramp, and it's kind of low angle, and it's really it's not much of the climb anymore. Anyways, I'm belaying in the sun, and the temperature is minus 32. I got some time. Everything's going to be okay. I'm pretty fast on the descent, so it'll be fine. So Jerry's coming up, and all of a sudden the rope becomes tight. Jerry's taking a fall. Jerry's been around the block. No big deal. I'm not panicked. So I wait a little bit, maybe like 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The rope gets loose again. I take in some more slack, and then there's another fall. Time for me to kind of consider what's going on. So I tie off the belay, give myself some rope, and I lower myself down some 15 or 20 meters or so I can see Jerry. And I see Jerry, and his tools are topped out. And I go like, yeah, Jerry, you got it, buddy. And all I hear is, boot. It's like, and I kind of heard exactly what he said. You didn't hear what I said, but that's how my brain processed it. What Jerry said, as the words say here, I lost my effing boot. And my brain just can't process it. I mean, 20 years of climbing, I've seen all kinds of stuff. I've had guests throw their ice axes at me during like a filming of like The Amazing Race because they had to get the tab, and I'm like, playing the Matrix, trying to avoid the falling ice axes. I've seen all kinds of stuff. I've heard people say, how does the fall look on a party that's above me on Lake Louise Falls as you're about to take a fall like you would in the gym? All kinds of stuff. But a lost boot? Not really. So Jerry had lost a boot. It was really cold, and he kept the toes a bit looser, and the boot had tipped off. Probably the cuff had undone itself. So I quickly get to the anchor. I kind of know what's going to happen. I create a bit of a raising system, and I've instructed Jerry to kind of just do whatever he can to get there. He gets within sight of me and really close, and I help him up to the anchor and get him to sit down. And immediately, I put his foot against my skin. We patch up some hot packs on there, and I immediately grab my radio. Because of the cold, as I was dialing the radio, it kept on turning through the channels. I couldn't communicate with Parks. I then go to my cell phone, and the cell phone is dead. So by then I have a little bit of frost of screaming barfies. So I kind of like, hunch over and sort of like tell Jerry, I'm going to be a minute here, man. Gathering myself, gathering my thoughts. Then I get everything I can out of my jacket, out of my pack. And I got everything in there that I'm supposed to have, and maybe even a bit more, but there's very little I can do. The day before, I just finished a guides training, ski touring in Whistler, and in my pack, because we're using our phones for navigation a lot, I had an external battery. That external battery allowed me to communicate with Parks Canada, where I talked with Conrad Jensen and said, hey, Conrad, this is the situation. And I was like, what's your ETA? And he's like, 45 minutes to about an hour. So I was like, okay, well, when you guys get here, I'll no longer be a guide. And sure enough, when Alex Lawson and Lisa Paulson showed up, Alex flew off with Jerry, and I flew off with Lisa. The sun had wrapped around the corner. We'd lost the sun. It was very, very cold. We got down to some warm vehicles, and then straight to the hospital, where Jerry spent if I remember correctly, spent the evening or several hours underneath these blankets, these air blankets, to warm himself up. I ended up losing a little bit of a toe from frostbite. It fell off in the shower about a couple weeks later. Not too much of a deal. I've had my bouts with frostbite and frost nip and fingers and toes, and I have most of everything left though. So, but anyways, that was the coldest moment I've had in many years, and a scary one, despite being so close to the road. So, FYI, never take your proximity to the road as a sign of safety. Anyways, I'm glad, Jerry. We found the boot. It was a couple 100 meters lower a couple days later. That was a crazy one. Lost the boot. The next guests I want to talk about are Keith and Tanya. Keith in specific. Keith and Tanya came as a package. They're a couple. And Keith is the hammer, known as the hammer. And Tanya, to me, is the trucker. Why? Because she has, when she gets excited or nervous, she swears like no one I've ever met in my entire life, including my father. And that's a lot of swearing. Keith and I climbed a whole bunch throughout the years. Here's a harder conditions on a lean Pilsner pillar. Keith and I met on a hot ice program years ago. Our first route was, I think, a mixed master. And Keith had some demons to work out, and he really wanted to push himself. He had some goals he wanted to achieve. He still has goals. Keith and I have been out an enormous amount of days throughout my career, both summer and winter, the Bugaboos, the Rockies. We've been out on mountain bikes, a lot of cool stuff together. Throughout the years with Keith and a lot of my guests, sometimes, you're climbing stuff. I can't recall where this was exactly, but assuming what I can see, I was probably trying to be creative here by making the route a little bit more challenging. So sometimes, on average, I tend to take the easy lines on routes. And sometimes, because of what the ice, the available ice that you have, you might decide to push it a little bit. And, learning how to do that is an important skill that guides must have ice climbing in the Canadian Rockies. You don't always have your pick of routes, and you have to be creative sometimes to deliver the goods that will bring satisfaction to the day. So therefore, you have to be a little bit stronger than what's necessary sometimes. Keith obviously is a competent ice climber by himself. Here we share pitches. So folks that climb with me for some time, sometimes we swap leads. I have guests have led quite hard pitch, to be honest with you, at least grade 5 for sure. It all depends. I have to have a lot of trust, and they have trust in me. This is one of the cool days for Keith and I. This is some time ago now. This was my first time guiding Polar Circus. We were on top of pitch 4. There's a long story that I won't kind of totally get into, but Keith here, it was a lifelong dream. He bailed before on the project of climbing Polar Circus, had almost sort of folded. And that morning I called, when we met, I said, just keep driving north. And I didn't really tell him what we were doing. And because, we had a little bit of nervousness sometimes, and this was a way of me managing it. And that day was a 7-hour round trip, car to car, and which is a pretty fast time for Polar Circus. I haven't guided Polar Circus a whole bunch, 4 times in my career. It's a route that I don't find physically that difficult, but I find a very serious route. And always kind of like those of you that might go on and climb Polar Circus, always be careful on that route. It doesn't matter if it's avalanche the day before. There's a lot of big features on the route, big snow mushroom, little cornices, things like that tend to kind of dislodge and come down during the day when things warm up. Guiding the way. This kind of feels like a fast chat for a guiding passion. Guiding is not the same as climbing for me. If I have, in my climbing world, I have, let's say, everything from bouldering to sport climbing and trad climbing and crack climbing. And the only thing I don't like is A climbing. Bore is the living dead. I thought, it feels like work. If I want to go A climbing, maybe I'll become like a rope access technician or something. But guiding is its own thing. And here's a recent picture this year with my friends from Seattle, and we're on Guinness Gully here at the top of the last pitch of Guinness, and some rope management and so on and so forth. So as a guide, one of the key things is to pick the right route on the right day for the people that you're with, and that has to do with conditions. It has to do with their abilities. It has to do with temperatures, and be very comfortable with your rope management skills. Efficiency is very important. And when it comes to ice climbing, it's highly important, the most important, because you don't want to be wasting time in a cold environment, especially in the Canadian Rockies when you're exposed to a lot of avalanche hazard. So I'm a firm believer that I spend as little time as possible in avalanche terrain. That has been my focus for as long as I've been guiding. I spend as little time as possible in avalanche terrain. So at this stage, I'm already thinking about how I'm coming down. In your rope systems, there's a variety of ways to set up your ropes. Clear instruction on how to manage your system on your guest's behalf. And here is probably Keith, I think, like seconding and tailing the rope in sort of like a caterpillar formation, I guess is what they call that. Timing, this is another route early this year. This is a snow line, I believe, really thin. I tried to delay the start as long as possible. We've been getting up earlier and earlier every year for routes. There's more and more competition. Other climbers, recreational climbers, if I can say that, really increase my exposure and my risk. And it's probably been my biggest level of anxiety over the last 4 or 5 years or so. It adds a whole layer of risk and vulnerability for me. So here I end up climbing my headlamp in really thin conditions. I think I'm trying to get some gear in here. But yeah, picking the right time. So I was probably an hour too early. But had I not been that early, I wouldn't have gotten to climb the route. Then avalanches. This was at the end of a skiing day, coming back on the Spray Lakes, and there's this like natural avalanche that came down just south of Mud Lake or Bristol Pass area. Anyone kind of getting into ice climbing in the Canadian Rockies, even as a guest, I recommend taking an avalanche course to start things off, but always having an air of a bit more cautious, because you don't really manage the conditions quite as much. You enter the terrain and you're in that terrain for the duration of the time that you're climbing. And that's why I took on this philosophy, as I spoke of, is I spend as little time as possible in avalanche terrain. I'd say like 5 out of 6 times when I climb Guinness Gully, I typically drag my ropes to the road and I start coiling at the road. Why? Even if the conditions that day are, I would be willing to bet $1,000 or $100,000 that there's not going to be an avalanche, I'll still do the same thing. It's kind of a protocol that I developed over the years for myself. And being an ice guide in the Canadian Rockies, avalanches are something that you must become an expert on. And having that said, being an expert doesn't mean that you're making all of the decisions yourself. You're reaching out a lot, and you're doing the smart thing, and the professional thing is being super informed before you get out. As recreationalists, you got to do the same thing and err on the side of caution, knowing that sometimes you have to wait 2 or 3, 4, or maybe more years before it kind of seems it actually is reasonable to get onto a route. I've never been avalanched while working, and I've triggered avalanches while skiing, but and alpine climbing, I've triggered small avalanches, but ice climbing, I have never been avalanched. Overhead hazard, one of the most sort of like obvious, but somehow inobvious hazard to ice climbers. is overhead hazard coming from icicles or other climbers. This is Johnson's Canyon, a place I feel as a community we get lucky every single year. Big ice can fall off there. Some of that stuff is the size of buses. And like I said, we get super, super, super lucky every year. They come down every single year, multiple times a year. Somehow we manage to not have people present. So don't be complacent. Not a place to go top roping, FYI. And then how does one survive sort of like 20 years of ice climbing at 100 days of winter? Well, you know what? You've got to be much fitter, much stronger than the requirements are. Because my focus is my clients, my focus are the conditions, my focus is where do I put the best route for the people that are going to follow me. If you're pretty fit, you can go out a couple times a week, do some hard routes. But if you're guiding hard route after hard route, meaning like grade 5 or so or more, routes like some of the routes I've guided are like, Upper Weeping Wall, like I mentioned, Sea of Vapors, Rainbow Serpent, or even just some routes are waterfall ice 4 plus, but they feel really hard that day. And you need to be fit. So one of the ways I find that staying fit for me was early on was dry tooling, indoor dry tooling, using a splice. For those that don't know what a splice is, it's plywood with holes and you just put your tools in. Keep it steep. In terms of mixed climbing for fitness, for ice climbing, don't bother going much harder than M10 kind of thing, because that requires specific skills, specific training. You got to be careful with your shoulders. But up to like M8, M9 or so, I think it kind of does translate more directly to ice climbing. Some of the things you want to train ice climbing that we don't think about other than the group set of rock skills or rock thickness is quads. So like doing deadlifts, something we don't think about. People think about the calves a lot, but the quads, every time you stand up, you're more or less doing a deadlift. Swinging, you're required to have like good stabilizer muscles in your shoulders, or the shoulders are the things that I've hurt the most over the years, and forearms, so you can hold on for quite some time. I use try to find some accessible training. So big days of ice guiding, I might still need to train in the evenings. So I've always maintained some access to a home wall of some sort. This is a system wall, not very wide, very systematic training. Without getting into too much detail on that, you might want to research that a little bit. And how I train on my system wall and most of the exercises I do, I use a tool called Tabata. So it's an online app you can download on Androids. They're free. So basically you're climbing for like 20 seconds or doing the exercise for 20 seconds, rest for 10, 8 cycles. I repeat that 4 times with about 15 minutes of rest in between. So I do this even for rock climbing as a maintenance tool right now, non-specific maintenance. It gives me like so power endurance for rock climbing. I found for ice climbing, since it's so repetitive, it's very good. So I would train swinging, I would train the movements, and I would train my legs with the same kind of like ratios here of 20 on, 10 off, and 8 cycles times 4 sets. And that's kind of like the gist of a little bit of how I kind of went about it. Those are kind of curious. You can reach out. And if you have more questions, I'd be happy to kind of like chat about that. The future for me, probably skiing. I don't think I'm done ice climbing, that's for sure. And my skiing, well, there's a lot of good skiing to do, all kinds, powder skiing and all that kind of stuff. But for me, probably it's kind of like painting new things, right? I'm a creative person, ambitious. I like the challenges. I like big days. And ski alpinism for me is, other than, it's a bit different than ski mountaineering, I find, is like ski alpinism is going to imply some form of climbing, the use of gear. And I think the Canadian Rockies are an amazing place for that. And it's too bad now. There's a whole bunch to do, but maybe next time, maybe next year. So if you're out there and it gets exciting, just make sure to stay calm and just listen to the guide. The guide should make you feel comfortable, make you laugh. Even in the most stressful of times, you should feel in confidence with the guide. So if there's any questions, go ahead and you can ask them. Oh, looks like there has been some questions. Cool. What brings you back to Guinness so often? Well, good question. First off, it's a good route, right? Like, I don't climb routes that are not good. And Guinness Gully is a great route with an option to go a little bit bigger. So if the conditions are right, meaning the avalanche conditions are reasonable, and I finish the first 3 pitches, which is your standard Guinness, I have options to boot pack up a little higher, a good probably about 500 of elevation gain or 300 meters of elevation gain to get to Guinness Stout or High Test. And those are kind of like waterflies 4+, 5-. They typically are not climbed very often. They feel kind of hard for the grade because you have to hack quite a bit. So the reason why I would go to Guinness often is in the beer walls. This is an area of field. It's an area that's a bit more sheltered. So wind slabs and other kind of like snow formations are less likely to occur there. Most of the avalanches I've experienced on Guinness tend to happen in periods of warmer conditions. So fairly controllable avalanche phenomenon there. So that's one reason. 2, it's close to the road, so short walks. And 3, like I said, good quality. So hopefully, Martin, that answers your question. What do you like about guiding ice? Tips for staying warm. First tip for staying warm, guiding ice for me is being fit. It's very important to be climbing fit. So imagine that your forearms and your hands are maxed out in warm conditions. When it's colder, our capillaries close down. We tend to get silly hands and stuff like that. And we're holding on to our tools these days. So first thing to be warm is to be strong. So for me, ice climbing, at the risk of sounding sort of not so humble, for the most part, most ice that I climb recreationally, short of like, things like what Will Gadd has pursued, where the grades are kind of like astonishingly high, like, grade 9 and 10 ice and stuff like that. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to like vertical ice, slightly overhanging ice, grade 6, 6+. They're mentally taxing, but physically not so taxing for me. So, fitness is a big deal. And within there, keeping on the theme of the hands, then you have to figure out your tools. So having the good tools that make you more efficient, spending a little less time, frequently letting go of your tools so you can bring your hand below your heart and shaking out. So much like sport climbing, resting on the route, ice climbing, we're warming up while we're climbing. Don't let it go too far. Eating well in the morning is probably the third thing. I eat massive breakfasts, 3-4 eggs, like 1,000-calorie breakfasts. I don't tend to eat during the day. I have a green apple every day I guide. That's kind of what I do. I don't drink water, but I would suggest that most individuals should drink some fluid throughout the day. That helps keeps you warm. And then having the right layering. So on cold days, I don't like starting off cold. I start off warm and I layer down as I need. We're not running, we're kind of walking. So that's kind of like one of the tricks. Another trick you could probably use is use foot warmers and stick them onto the wrists here. So they kind of heat up your blood vessels and help circulation along. hopefully that answers your question about staying warm. And the other one is your head. So having like, I have a lot of hoods. One of my best friends, Sarah Hunikin, and I sometimes would be at Crags and we could count the hoods. So you never have enough hoods. Favorite early season route and 10 routes, 10 route later in the season or one later in the season.
Favorite early season and favorite later in the season.
Okay. Yeah, I guess my favorite early season route is probably Twisted Sister. Kind of a mixed climb. And I like it. It's sort of like front and center as I come into Canmore, you can see it. Super cool route. Really neat. Twisted area is also early, the one route I talked about earlier. It's typically hard early season, and I like that. Kind of gives me a bit of a spanking, and if I've been mountain biking too much, I really get worked. And if I've been sport climbing a whole bunch, then I usually feel a bit happier at the end of my day. One route later in the season. I guess one late season route that I often think of and hope for is Superbach. It's a great route. It's nice to have the snowpack settled. And it's a really cool route to get up in there, especially the later season. Certain areas of the route get filled out a bit more, and it's a really good quality route. Another one is Curtain Call. So I've guided Curtain Call a bunch of times in my career, and I think I've always guided it in late March, April, and again, when it's really nice and filled in. It's been cleaned out, traveled. I've guided it once in the earlier picture where I cleaned my whole way up, and I don't think I'm going to do that again. That was a lot of work. What made you want to be a guide versus recreational climber? Awesome question. The straight up answer comes back to my first alpine route. So I went with a friend called Jean-François Plouffe, a French Canadian who now lives in Whistler. And we went to France, and I never placed a single ice screw, but my first alpine route was Lafrendo Spur. And it's amazing that I can actually tell this story. But we eventually topped out at l'Aiguille du Midi, and then our trip wasn't done. We were going to go climb Mont Blanc. So I'm like just knackered and just, go down, and we're camping on the valley. With anybody who's been in Chamonix, it's not often you see these tents up there and stuff. It was a timberline tent, weighed a ton. And I was struggling up the Mont Blancs, and I met a man who was climbing, and I was wondering how I could be a better climber, and I was struggling, and he was a mountain guide. So I thought back then that a good climber had to be a mountain guide. And I think that kind of stayed in my mind. And then the men and the women that I met early on in my career as a climber that were guides were really inspiring. And that's kind of what I wanted to do. It's been a long time, and it's a hard question to answer, but I just felt that guides got good training and they were exceptional climbers. And I think for some of us, that's kind of true. Through guiding, we became better climbers, and I believe I became a better person in the process. What made you want to be ski mountaineering skis? What do you use? Cool, great question. I think when it comes to ski mountaineering, or the skimo, where all the skis are really narrow and so on and so forth, it kind of depends on what you're about to ski, right? You could be on top of a mountain and you want a bit more of a ski than. So currently I'm skiing for K2, and I have a K2 Waybacks or 106s. They're kind of my all-arounder. I ski a bunch of stuff with those skis. I have Dynafit bindings, the Dynafit Tour Turn, I use those because they're easy to manipulate in powder conditions. I don't have to come off my ski. After I've toured up, I can remove my skins and turn my bindings and clip in and do my Hoji boots, and then I'm going downhill. They're a ski that also hold a fairly good edge in some firm conditions or variable conditions, especially breakable crusts and stuff. I want a bit of a wider ski, and I find 106 in the Rockies underfoot is kind of like, for me, is the great all-rounder. It does a lot of stuff really well. If you're going to go ski a lot of powder, maybe up to 116, but I don't really attribute powder skiing and ski mountaineering together too much. You get more variable conditions, powder skiing or couloir skiing. And then I have a pair of way back 88s. Those things are challenging in hard conditions, very challenging because they're narrow underfoot, so you have to keep your feet together. But when you're dealing with really icy conditions, that ski is inspiring. It's also short. I ski it kind of short, 174, which is kind of short for me. I like to believe I'm 5'9", but the reality is a few ground falls later, I'm about 5'8". And, but wait, yeah. And so yeah, it's a great ski for that. It's also lightweight on your back, and short for couloirs when you can side slip in areas where you can't really make turns safely. So if you're going to go into full-on spring conditions, something closer to 90 or 80 something underfoot is probably advisable. Ski mountaineering K2. Okay, cool. Come on. Anyone who wants to try ice climbing but thinks they can not. Okay, cool. Cool. So fitness regarding ice climbing. Everyone can try ice climbing. Seriously. I have literally seen every possible individual. I think I've actually guided someone that had like very low percentage visible acuity. Like they were not blind legally, but they couldn't drive legally. Age, I think 76, 77 was the oldest gentleman I've ever introduced to ice climbing. Ice climbing, with the right instructor or the right guide, if you don't have the strength to swing in hard ice, they'll pick a route that's easier to learn on. So I think there's no real limit to who can try ice climbing.